Stadia is Google's new gaming service powered by Linux and open source technology. Also, many open source projects struggle to make money. According to one article writer, open source doesn't make any money because it isn't designed to make money. Is that really true? We're going to discuss that today. Are you still on Windows 7? If you are, you're about to start seeing a new nag screen telling you to move to Windows 10. But why not move to Linux instead? Richard Stallman recently published a new article about Install Fest and installing non-free distributions on people's machines. What to do about this deal with the devil. Also, we have new app releases. Geary 3.32, OpenShot 2.4.4, and KeePassXC 2.4.0 are all released this week. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is the gigantic news about Google's new gaming service called Stadia. So, this article comes from OMG Ubuntu. This is written by Joey Snedden. Stadia is Google's new gaming service powered by Linux and open source tech. So, Stadia is Google's new gaming service. It's basically cloud gaming. It is streamed gaming over the internet. So, you can play it on any device that can connect to the internet. You no longer need a console to game or a powerful desktop PC or even a laptop with a dedicated GPU and a pretty decent CPU. No, you can pretty much game on anything now due to this cloud native gaming service. So because it's cloud-based gaming, again, you don't need, dedicated equipment for this, and no more gaming consoles and that sort of thing. If you have a smart TV that can connect to the internet, you should be able to game just fine on that. Games are said to be streamed at up to 4K at 60 frames per second. Of course, that's going to depend on connection. It sounds good. I get, what Google is pushing here. Now, of course, there's going to be some downsides to such a streaming service. First of all, Google, they haven't revealed details on pricing or availability. As far as availability, all they've said is that it will launch this year, whatever that means, sometime this year. And they said it will launch for sure in USA, Canada, UK, and, quote, most of Europe. So, if you're in the US, Canada, and UK, you're probably going to get the service as soon as it's available. Certain other parts of Europe, maybe. The rest of the world, who knows? They really haven't given us any details on that. Of course, no details on the pricing. The fact that this is a streaming gaming service does call into question things like latency issues, lag, input lag, bandwidth issues. I mean, this is not going to be the same kind of gaming experience you get on a real machine, playing games that are actually on your physical machine. There will be some downsides to this. Another downside, I can already hear some people, in their mind, what about the privacy concerns? A lot of people don't like using Google services to begin with, and now this is just another Google service. Now they're streaming games to me. They know everything I do. They're of course going to be mining your data through this. For one thing, because of the latency issues and the input lag, Google has said that to combat some of that, there will be some predictive behavior stuff going on with what you do with your controller or your keyboard, however it is that you end up playing this game, to help deal with some of the latency issues. So the more that they figure out exactly your gaming patterns, the better they will be able to predict what you are going to do in the game to help offset some of those latency issues. For me, I think that's a big privacy concern, that they basically say that they're basically keylogging you, right? I mean, that's how they're going to combat that latency issue. It's a keylogger. We know kind of your patterns and your behaviors with our controller. I personally would not be okay with something like that, but again, most of average computer users and most gamers are probably going to be oblivious to the fact that Google is employing such techniques. For those of us that really love free and open source software, Google is really touting the fact that they built this thing using Linux and open source software. A quote from one of the folks over at Google, quote, "Google believes that open source is good for everyone. It enables and encourages collaboration and the development of technology solving real-world problems," unquote. So this thing was built with Linux, Vulkan, LLVM, the DirectX shader compiler, etc. One of the interesting aspects here is, will there be any kind of overspill from Google using all this Linux and open source software to power Stadia? Will there be any overspill, into other related gaming technologies and gaming companies, gaming platforms? Possibly. If a company like Google is employing things like Linux and Vulkan, and game companies especially start developing games specifically to run on Stadia, it's not a far-fetched notion to think that those same companies wouldn't see the value of a Linux gaming platform and maybe make their games available on something like Steam, which also uses Linux and Vulkan. So my thoughts on this is I really am not sure how successful a cloud gaming service would be, a game streaming service. It sounds good, I mean, in theory, but like serious gamers that want the best performance, you can't have these streaming game services ever compete with actual game consoles or dedicated PCs built for gaming running real hardware. One thing, the latency issues, the input lag, and your bandwidth issues and all that, because everything is streamed over the internet. You're basically connecting to a remote server that is actually running the game. It's not actually your machine running the game. There's just too many issues with that. Also, for somebody like me that is a little more privacy oriented than just your average computer user, I don't like the fact that Google, this is just another way for Google to data mine you in some way. And the second story on the docket tonight is an article I came across a couple of days ago about open source projects that are struggling to make money. So many of them can't ever really have any kind of financial success. They can't raise enough money to pay developers, or developers can't even make a decent living working on open source software. And this article that I came across is basically a blog post here. This was written by Ian Bicking, and of course I'm going to link to the blog post in the show description. Open source doesn't make money because it isn't designed to make money. Or the best way to do something is to at least try. So this particular blog post, again, I just came across it a couple of days ago, and it struck me. He does make a point. Open source software, the idea of the free software movement and the open source software movement, they never were built with the idea of people actually making money. They weren't built with the idea of people not making money, but the idea of actually being profitable by writing code was never a concern with these movements. These movements were more political in nature rather than, focusing on things like somebody actually being able to put food on the table and support a family by writing open source software. Reading a little bit from Ian here, he writes that, quote, "I'm thinking about this now because Mozilla would like to diversify its revenue in the next few years, and one constraint we have is that everything we do is open source. There are dozens, hundreds of successful open source projects that have tried to become even just modest commercial enterprises, some very seriously. The results aren't great." So I guess Ian works for Mozilla, and Mozilla is trying to diversify its revenue. You guys see Mozilla is announcing various new projects and new services they're offering. I think on last week's episode of Taking Into Account, we talked about Firefox Send, which I thought was a great service to offer. Really, Mozilla has really broadened their stable of various services that they offer. And why are they doing that? It's to try to make money. Mozilla really can't figure out how to make money with open source software. And in this article here, Ian writes that he is thinking about this because he's trying to pitch a commercial endeavor in Mozilla right now. And so he's trying to come up with some kind of plan how to make money for Mozilla. But he also writes that it's not just open source software that it's tough to make money. There are other things in life that people just can't really make money at. So he starts thinking about the world in general. We all know it's really tough, almost impossible to make a living making music or making art or even things like taking care of children. What about being a teacher? In many states, teachers basically work at or below the poverty line. There are lots of things. There are a lot of professions that people have out there that you're just never going to really make any money at. You're never going to be, quote, successful at. So open source software is kind of one of those things. Unfortunately, it's really tough. Nobody gets rich writing open source software. And Ian here contemplates that it's not just licensing that holds software back from making money. He says there's certain types of software that do make money, but certain types of software will never make money. And one of the examples he makes here is OpenSSL. What if you decided to take OpenSSL, great piece of open source software, and put it behind some kind of licensing paywall, put a proprietary license on it, give it an actual real price, people have to buy it. Would people pay for OpenSSL? He says it seems unlikely. I would say it's very unlikely people would pay for that software. The license isn't what's holding it back. Quote, it's just not shaped like something that makes money. Solving important problems isn't enough. And unquote. Yeah, he's right. He's right. It's not necessarily the license that holds something back. It's some things are just not what we think of as something I would pay money for. And a project like OpenSSL is one of those. Something like a game we just talked about, game streaming, the service Stadia for Google. How about Steam? Everybody pays for Steam games. That's just normal. We expect to have to pay for those, especially AAA title games that we all love to play. One of the things this particular blog post mentions is people will pay a little bit for apps, not a lot, but some. People will throw money at some open source projects, but for these open source projects to actually make money, scaling up requires marketing, capital. Open source projects, I can tell you, very few of them know how to market themselves. Very few of them are business savvy. They don't have any clue how to raise revenue. If they had a bunch of revenue coming in, they don't really know how to manage that revenue. They're not businesses for the most part. Open source projects mostly are just developers that want to code. That's all they signed up for. They just want to write code. So all this other stuff, like raising money and marketing yourself, most open source projects have absolutely no clue how to do something like that. Ian also mentions that one way to monetize for open source projects is actually putting ads on something. So, for example, he's talking about Mozilla. So Mozilla has, a web browser, Firefox. Maybe put ads in it. I think that would be a horrible idea. He does too. But because that's just going to run everybody off. I would rather pay for Firefox. Give Firefox a few bucks to use your browser than you bombard me with any kind of ads in the browser. So that would definitely just kill off Mozilla right away. Mozilla would never do something stupid like put ads in the browser. At least I hope they wouldn't. Ian mentions that people will often pay if you offer them a personalized solution to something. That's an interesting point. He mentions also people will typically pay if you are dedicated and you give them ongoing attention. I could see that too. Many open source projects, many open source companies like Red Hat and Canonical and SUSE, how do they make all their money? It's through selling support licenses, for their commercial Linux distributions. Why are people willing to pay? Is because when you pay for that, you're guaranteed I've got somebody I can call 24/7, 365 when I have a support request. So people do pay for something like that. And one of the things Ian also mentions is people will pay for anything that is paired with a physical device. So if your open source software is paired with some kind of physical device to go along with it, obviously people will pay for that. People expect to pay for tangible objects, right? Paying for code is not a tangible object that most people, people want something they can feel for the most part if they're going to shell out money for it. Not of course people like us that are open source and software enthusiasts, but your average day-to-day person just walking around on the streets, they give money for actual physical objects. The last paragraph, he mentions that he remains pessimistic about open source software ever finding commercial success. Ian here is frustrated that there is so much open source software out there. And right now, open source software, the movement is exploding. Everybody is on the open source software bandwagon. But when you look at commercial products and commercial successes, companies and software companies that actually make money, It's all proprietary software. You don't really see anybody being successful with open source software, and I share his frustration in that. And the third story on the docket tonight is that there will be a new Get Windows 10 nag screen arriving in Windows 7 in the coming days. We talked about this a little bit on a previous episode of Taking Into Account a while back, that you were going to start seeing these nag screens in Windows 7 very soon, because Microsoft is really, they're going to start practically begging people to get off of Windows 7. Support for Windows 7 ends next year. And they want to go ahead and start pushing people now, a good year in advance. Hey, get on Windows 10, get off of Windows 7. We're going to stop supporting it. On this date, we're done with Windows 7. Move to Windows 10. Obviously, I think they're going to do some extended support on Windows 7 for like enterprise customers, but for your typical desktop, laptop, computer user, if you're on Windows 7, I understand why you're still on Windows 7 rather than on Windows 10, especially for those that are doing it out of privacy concerns. I get that. Other than the privacy concerns, security concerns should also be in your mind, and Windows 7 is not going to have support for much longer, so you're going to have to move to something. Microsoft is asking you to move to Windows 10. Obviously, what I would suggest, those of you that have family members, many of you have family members that are still running Windows 7 on certain machines, let them know that Windows 7, the end of life for Windows 7 is approaching very fast, and maybe talk to those folks about Linux, or just tell them, hey, the computer's very old. It may not even be able to run Windows 10, but I have this thing called Ubuntu or whatever you want to put on it. Put a user-friendly distribution like Ubuntu or Mint, or even something like SUSE would be okay. Elementary, MX Linux, perfect. Something like that. Put that on those laptops that are still running Windows 7. Hopefully we can convert some people, because especially now's the right time to start moving some of these people over to Linux from Windows, because the stuff that used to hold people back, where people had to run Windows rather than move to something like Linux, is less of an issue. Microsoft Office for a long time was the big thing that held people back, but now because so much stuff is done in the cloud, you have things like Office 365 now and Google Docs, and most people now for a Office suite, they're using one of these web-based Office suites, so it's not even an issue anymore as far as MS Office for a lot of people. Now, some people still use the desktop client Microsoft Office products because wherever they work require them to use that. I get that, but for many people this is a non-issue. So the other big thing that tends to hold people back, gaming, not much of an issue now because of Steam for Linux. Now is the right time to see if we can't move people away from Windows 7 in particular, since they're going to start getting these nag screens telling them that they have to get off of Windows 7 anyway. Talk to your friends and family about Linux. The next story I really want to cover, just as a segue, is actually about installing Linux, GNU/Linux on people's machines. So I got an email the other day. I am a member of the Free Software Foundation, and I get emails about new, articles written by folks over at the Free Software Foundation. Richard Stallman, in particular, wrote this article, Install Fests, What to Do About the Deal with the Devil. So what are Install Fests? They are these get-togethers where these Linux get-togethers where, a lot of places have Linux user groups, LUGs, where people get to, get together once a month and talk about their experiences with Linux and open source software and things like that. And at a lot of these Linux user groups, these LUG meetings, a lot of times it involves people just bringing machines and getting help installing whatever Linux distribution on their laptop or desktop or whatever. And of course, the free software movement have these things called Install Fests, where of course they want to promote free software. So they want to install free GNU/Linux distros on these people's machines, 100% free, especially somebody like Richard Stallman, who is a ideologue. Richard Stallman does not want any part of any non-free software at all. But at the same time, this particular article from Richard Stallman is very pragmatic. He understands the fact that people bring machines to these install fests, and these machines cannot run a 100% free GNU/Linux distro. And by 100% free, I mean the Free Software Foundation approved distros like Triskel and Parabola and things like that. Many machines simply can't run those distros. Why? It's because they have Wi-Fi cards that don't have open source drivers, or they have a graphics card that requires non-free drivers to function correctly. NVIDIA, I'm looking at you. You can't put somebody on a 100% free distro if the machine they have simply will not run a free distro. If the certain components of that machine and have non-free drivers, non-free firmware, you can't just stick Triskel on a machine that you know it's not going to run it properly. And basically all you're going to do is just tick these people off that you ever put that on their machine anyways. Many of these people were coming from Windows or Mac, and they're just going to run back to Windows because their experience with GNU/Linux was so bad. Now, don't get this completely twisted. Richard Stallman is not suggesting that at these install fests that somebody brings a machine and, there's no way it could run a 100% free Linux distribution and you just stick Ubuntu on it and just give it back to them. No, Richard is saying that what you should do is try to educate these people. If they have a machine that will not run 100% free software, explain to them why. Explain to them that, some of the peripherals and, their Wi-Fi chip and their graphics card, their dedicated graphics card and various firmware and all this stuff, that what components of their machine are incompatible, and also explain to them maybe why it is important to run 100% free software. Explain to them basically the ideology, the politics behind it. Stallman does not want you to make the choice for the person, but explain to them, reading a little bit here, quote, "The non-free software means the user sacrifices freedom for functionality. If a user has to wrestle with this choice, they could draw a moral lesson from it and maybe get a better computer later." So yeah, let them know, hey, I can put Ubuntu or Fedora or whatever on your machine and it will work 100% perfect. But wouldn't it be better if you changed out some of the components of your machine or just got a new machine altogether and were able to run free software on it, 100% free software, for moral reasons? And some people will be fine with that. Some people will reject that. Most people are actually going to reject that. Most people are pragmatists. They just want a machine that runs. And that's fine, but let them make the choice. Don't make the choice for them. Don't stick something you know is not going to run on their machine for them. Also, don't just put, a distro like Ubuntu or Fedora or something like that on their machine without letting them know about the free software movement. And that's what Richard is promoting here. And Richard Stallman is never going to install a non-free distro on somebody's machine for ideological reasons. He would never do that. But he's not against, in this article, having somebody at these install fests that will put those non-free distros on somebody's machine, but it should not be heavily advertised. They should be off in a corner somewhere, and that person that's doing that, yes, I'll put, Ubuntu or Fedora or Debian or whatever on your machine, but let me tell you a little bit about free software. Try to educate the people about the free software movement as you're doing it. And I think, again, I was actually pretty surprised about this particular article. Of course, I'm going to link to the article in the show description. I suggest you guys read it. This is a very pragmatic approach by Richard Stallman. Sometimes Richard Stallman comes across as very stubborn, but not so in this article. I was pleasantly surprised by this article. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight is actually 3 stories. New app releases. And I wanted to cover these because I like all 3 of these projects. So they had new releases this week. I wanted to highlight them very briefly. The first one is Geary. Geary is an email client. Geary 3.32 has just been released. Full disclosure, I'm actually using Geary right now. I've been using Geary as my email client for the last couple of months. I haven't told you guys, haven't made a video about me using Geary on the channel. But previously, I you guys know I'm a Mozilla Firefox user. That's been my browser of choice since the beginning of time, and before that, Netscape, going back into the 90s. So I have been on that browser forever. I've been a Thunderbird user for my email client forever. Now, if I want a terminal-based email client, I do have NeoMut installed on my machine and configured and working. But for a graphical email client, it's been Thunderbird for me forever. But recently, I decided to play around with some other email clients just to test things out. And I installed Geary, and I got to tell you, it's fantastic. The interface is very clean, very intuitive. It is nowhere near as feature-rich as something like Thunderbird. But for 99.9% of you guys out there, it's got everything you need for an email client, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for a good desktop email client. Geary 3.32 just released this week. Other releases, OpenShot 2.4.4 has been released. OpenShot is a open source video editor. OpenShot is interesting because it's been around for a while, but it has always gotten kind of a bad rap. Why? Because OpenShot, like many other open source video editors, it's not just OpenShot, but OpenShot was buggy as hell for a long time. I've tried to use OpenShot in the past. A couple of years ago, OpenShot was not usable. It crashed all the time. I would never use it for serious work. But you know what? It's not unlike other video editors I've tried in the past, things like Pativi and Kdenlive, which is great now, but if you tried Kdenlive a few years ago, Kdenlive was just riddled with bugs and crashed all the time. It was a complete crash fest too, but it got better. And apparently OpenShot has been getting a lot better here lately. A lot of people tell me OpenShot is, especially the latest releases, including the newly released 2.4.4, much better, much improved. It might be something I need to take a look at. Also, latest release for KeePassXC. KeePassXC just had a release of version 2.4.0. You will not find it anywhere on the KeePassXC website though. Why? It's because they released it and then immediately pulled it. I guess they found a couple of bugs, something they needed to correct, so they pulled it back down, but it will be released in a couple of days. The Mac version, I think somebody forgot to sign some kind of package for it, and that person that needed to sign it, it's not available for a couple of days, so the Mac version, I think they delayed. It'll be released Monday, and the Linux version, I think, had 2 bugs that they wanted to correct before re-releasing it. So sometime in the next couple of days, you should see the latest version of KeePassXC, which I believe is going to be 2.4.0. And that was the 5th and final story on the docket tonight. This was Taking Into Account episode 34. I try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account sometime every Thursday, so look for Taking Into Account episode 35 sometime next Thursday. As always, I try to end these episodes by reading a viewer question or comment on the show. Today, though, what I'm going to do is I wanted to highlight something new for the channel. So, on a live stream that I did, I think last Saturday, I did a live Q&A kind of live stream, and one of the folks in the YouTube chat said, "Hey, DT, why don't you start an IRC channel?" And you know what? I thought that was a great idea. So, what I did is I started a IRC channel. So this is over on the Freenode network, hashtag Distrotube is the channel. Let me zoom in. And this is the Distrotube IRC channel. So you guys want to hang out in IRC? It's only been up and running, I don't know, about 5 days now, but we have a couple of dozen people that tend to hang out there. We have good conversation. It's friendly. We talk, about Linuxy stuff, philosophy stuff, sometimes related to the free software movement, the open source software movement, and of course, sometimes off-topic stuff. But pretty friendly community we've already got going in a few days without really announcing it too much. So those of you that want an interesting way to interact with the greater Distrotube community, check out our IRC channel over at the Freenode network. Again, hashtag Distrotube is the channel. Before I go, I got to thank a few special people. This show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, Douglas, Dylan, Leo, Rob, Robert, and Tony. They're the producers of the show. Without them, this episode of Taking Into Account would not have been possible. The show is also brought to you by all those fine ladies and gentlemen. You guys see all those names on the screen. They help support my work over on Patreon. Without those supporters, again, this show would not be possible. If you would like to support the channel, please consider doing so. You'll find me at Distrotube over on Patreon. Alright guys, peace.